The name most people cannot pronounce belongs to a god most people cannot name, and that is exactly the point. Tyr. In Old Norse, one word. In the surviving myths, one hand, two stories, and a vanishing act that took 4,000 years to complete. The Norse gods sit on the edge of Europe like a late chapter in a much older book, and the name at the root of the whole pantheon points at the wrong god. The argument here is not discovery, it is demotion. The Norse sky father by descent is not Odin and not Thor. It is Tyr, a marginal figure in the myths his own people preserved, the god the linguistic evidence says should have been the sovereign of the pantheon, and the god who ended up with one hand and one binding story to show for it. Something displaced him. The displacement, not the family resemblance, is what this episode traces. The linguistic argument runs in one direction with remarkable precision. The Old Norse Tyr descends from Proto-Germanic tiwaz, which in turn comes from the Proto-Indo-European root diu, to shine, the daylit sky. From that same root, the Greeks produced Zeus and the Latins Jupiter, the reconstructed compound Diospita. Sky Father is the ancestor of them all. The Vedic tradition produced Diospita, a Sky Father figure attested in the Rig Veda, though already marginalized by Indra, which is itself the precedent for what happened in the Germanic branch. In Hesiod's Theogony, Zeus remains the supreme sovereign over gods and mortals, holding the position the name demands. The comparative method makes the relationship exact. Tyr, Zeus, and Jupiter are formally cognate, descended from the same word, filtered through Grimm's law and 4,000 years of separation. This is not resemblance. This is inheritance. What the Norse tradition did with that inheritance is the puzzle. In the poetic Edda, Tyr is not the supreme god. Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning describes him as the bravest of the Aesir, but makes clear he is not their ruler. The prose text that codified Norse myth for posterity positions him as secondary from its first mention. His genealogical record is contradictory and revealing. Snorri presents him as a son of Odin in the prose Edda, conflicting with Hymiskvida, which identifies his father as a Jotun, a giant, a surprising lineage for a figure who should by descent be the Sky Father himself. The surviving Norse texts disagree about the god who carried the oldest name in the pantheon, because the god had already been rewritten into a role that did not fit his inheritance. Tyr is conspicuously absent from the Norse eschatology. Voluspa, the poem that maps the entire arc of the cosmos from creation to Ragnarok, does not give him a seat at the events that define the fate of the gods. At the end of the world, Tyr fights the hound Gama, a secondary monster, not the wolf, and they kill each other. The god who should have been the Zeus of the Norse pantheon dies in a draw with a dog. Loki's mockery in Lokasenna cuts to the heart of the demotion. In that poem, the trickster god moves through the assembled deities, stripping each of their prestige, and when he turns to Tyr, the insult is specific. Tyr has lost his hand and cannot bring peace. Tyr attempts to defend the Aesir, but is dismissed as a secondary figure in the exchange. The poem's own dramatic structure treats him as already peripheral. In Hymiskvida, he needs Thor's help to retrieve a cauldron from his giant father, relying on the thunder god for tasks that a supreme deity would handle alone. Across the surviving texts, Tyr does not act like a sovereign. He acts like a god whose authority was stripped before the stories were ever set down. The linguistic evidence for the connection is not speculative. Linguists trace Tyr through Proto-Germanic tiwaz back to the Proto-Indo-European root diu, which carried the sense of shining or the daylit sky. From that root, the Greek branch produced Zeus, the Latin Jupiter, and the Vedic Diospita, the same figure in 3 phonological registers. Mallory and Adams document the sound changes that connect these forms across the Indo-European family. West traces the same route through the poetic and divine vocabulary it generated. The cognate relationship is among the most secure in the entire field of Indo-European linguistics, the kind of reconstruction that holds across every major scholarly treatment. The reconstructed compound Deus P-Shikter translates as Sky Father, and that is what Tyr should be. The Norse tradition preserved the name of the Sky Father deity, kept it alive in the very word that names the god, and then proceeded to reduce that god to a figure with two myths and a missing hand. The evidence from the primary texts is consistent. Tyr is brave, he is bound to oaths, and he is not in charge. The comparison with the other branches is instructive. In the Rig Veda, Diospita is present but marginal, overshadowed by Indra, who became the active sovereign of the Vedic pantheon. In Greece, Zeus held the full sovereign position the name demands, with no comparable displacement. In the Norse branch, Tyr occupies something closer to Diospita's Vedic position than to Zeus's Greek one, a skyfather reduced to a memory in his own tradition. The comparative method makes this pattern visible. The name carries an authority the myths do not grant. What displaced Tyr is the next question, and the answer is visible in the oldest documentary evidence the tradition left behind. The English language keeps a record that the Norse myths obscure. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Old English Tyrisdag, the day of the god whose name has outlasted his own pantheon. When Latin-speaking Romans named the same day Dies Martis after Mars, they were performing what scholars call the interpretatio Romana, the habit of mapping foreign gods onto familiar Roman ones. The Germanic skyfather was identified with Mars, the war god, not with Jupiter, the king of the gods. That identification is the displacement in its oldest form, a Roman observer on the empire's northern border, watching a pantheon that had already rearranged its own hierarchy. Tacitus's Germania preserves the classical testimony. In chapter 9, he records that the Germanic tribes primarily worship three deities, Mercury, Hercules, and Mars, and that Mars receives animal sacrifices. Scholars read these three as Odin, Thor, and Tyr, respectively. The equation of Tacitus's Mercury with Wodenas, the ancestor of Odin, is universal. The implication is arresting. By the 1st century CE, Odin had already taken the supreme position in the Germanic pantheon, while Tyr was understood through the lens of martial worship. The displacement was not a late Norse development. It was already complete when Tacitus wrote it down. The mechanism of the shift is the interpretatio Romana itself. When Roman observers mapped Germanic gods onto their own pantheon, they chose functional analogues, and the function they assigned to Tyr was war. Mars was the god of battle and soldierly virtue, not the sovereign of the cosmos. By absorbing Tyr into Mars's role, the interpretatio compressed a skyfather into a warrior and removed the theological pressure that had kept the name connected to supremacy. The old name survived in the weekday, in the runes carved by warriors, and in two myths. The old authority did not. The Norse attestations confirm the narrowing. In Lokasenna, Loki mocks Tyr for the hand he already lost, and for his inability to keep the peace among the gods. The poem treats him as a figure whose prestige is already spent, a god whose defining characteristic is absence rather than presence. Tyr attempts to defend the Aesir in the exchange, but is dismissed, his intervention insufficient, and his status secondary. In Hymiskvida, he needs Thor's help to retrieve a cauldron from his own father, a giant named Hymer, a task that a sovereign god would not require assistance to complete. Hymiskvida's genealogy is itself a sign of how far the displacement had gone. the former Skyfather's father is not a god, but a Jotun, a being the Aesir define themselves against. The god whose name reaches back to the oldest word in the Indo-European pantheon has been genealogically absorbed into the category of the monstrous. Snorri's Gylfaginning adds a telling contradiction. He presents Tyr as a son of Odin in the prose Edda, a genealogy that makes Odin not Tyr, the progenitor of the pantheon's most powerful line. The Eddic tradition cannot maintain a consistent origin story for the god who should by linguistic descent be its most ancient figure, because that figure's authority had been redistributed to Odin before the texts were composed. The myths that do survive center on sacrifice and loss. Tyr's primary surviving narrative is the binding of Fenrir, the wolf destined to kill Odin at Ragnarok. To bind the wolf with the magical ribbon Gleipnir, the gods needed a pledge, and Tyr placed his right hand in the wolf's mouth as a guarantee that the deception was honorable. When Fenrir realized he had been tricked and bound, he closed his jaw. Snorri records that the other gods laughed at Tyr's loss, a moment in the prose tradition that carries more weight than Snorri's casual tone suggests. The laughter of the gods at the maiming of their bravest member is the textual record of a displacement already complete. The god who sacrificed his hand to hold the wolf was already diminished before the binding happened. The hand placed in the wolf's mouth is the moment the Skyfather's authority became physical sacrifice. Tyr's sacrifice is not a warrior's death in battle. It is the deliberate placement of his own body as collateral for a promise the other gods had already decided to break. John Lindo reads the gesture as juridical. Tyr is acting as the guarantor of cosmic order, the one deity whose word the wolf could trust because the god's word was worthless. A juridical sovereign who must literally put his own flesh behind his oath is a sovereign whose power has already been hollowed out. The loss is final and total. Snorri relates that when Fenrir realized he was tricked, he bit off Tyr's hand at the wrist, and the other gods laughed. The laughter belongs to the pantheon that has already redistributed Tyr's authority. Lindo and Tervil Petra both read the one-handed motif as completing a process of demotion already underway. A god who has lost his hand is no longer fit for the combat that defines the Aesir, and a god who is no longer fit for combat is no longer a candidate for supremacy. The binding of Fenrir did not cause Tyr's displacement. It is the displacement already made visible in the body of the god who carried it. Something had already removed the Skyfather's authority before Tyr placed his hand in the wolf's mouth. The name survived. The position did not. Tyr has one surviving myth. Not a biography, not a cycle. One story told twice, in two texts separated by centuries. It begins with a wolf. Fenrir was growing faster than any creature the gods had ever known, and the Aesir understood, before the world did, that he would one day fill it. So they bound him. The first two bindings, the ordinary rope, then the stronger rope, he broke with the ease a man might break a reed. The third was different. Gleipnir was forged from 6 things that do not exist: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain. It is, scholars note, a rope made of impossibilities, a mythic way of saying the situation had no ordinary solution, and someone had to lead the wolf to it. Tyr stepped forward. He placed his hand inside Fenrir's mouth as a pledge, a living hostage against deceit. The wolf saw the trick too late. He thrashed, he strained, Gleipnir held, and in the convulsion, Fenrir closed his jaw. Tyr's hand came away at the wrist. John Lindo reads this as a juridical act, Tyr surrendering a part of himself to hold cosmic order in place, a sacrifice that makes him simultaneously the guarantor of law and its cost. Georges Dumézil placed the gesture within a pattern he argued ran across multiple Indo-European traditions, the sovereign god who gives something irreplaceable to keep the world from unmaking. The one-handed god, Dumézil suggested, may echo an ancient archetype of juridical sacrifice. Both readings agree on what follows. The moment the hand was lost, Tyr's role changed. A god who had once mediated between the Aesir and the wild was now physically unfit for the battles that define the Norse mythological present. When Fenrir realized he was tricked, he bit off Tyr's hand at the wrist, and the other gods laughed. That laughter is the argument. It is not the laughter of relief. It is the sound of a culture watching the god who should have been its supreme authority reduced to a one-handed figure the gods themselves no longer take entirely seriously. Because the demotion was already complete before the binding happened. Tyr's absence from the Norse tradition's own greatest story makes that absence structural, not accidental. He is not among the gods assembled at Ragnarok's prelude. He is not counseled in Voluspa's catalogue of what is to come. The poem that names every god who matters says nothing about Tyr's place in the end of the world, as though his role evaporated before the final chapter began. And when Ragnarok actually arrives, Tyr's adversary is not Fenrir. It is Garmr, the hound that guards Hell's gates, a secondary monster, not the wolf Tyr once pledged himself to. The god who held the wolf was already diminished when he reached for the rope. He had already been displaced. The hand in the mouth was the proof, not the cause. The evidence for that displacement is everywhere Tyr is not. Odin has 80 Voluspa stanzas devoted to his counsel and his fate. Thor is the poem's consistent defender against chaos. Tyr has Loki's mockery in Lokasenna and the loss of his hand in Gylfaginning. He is the god the Norse remembered by name. Tuesday, Teisdagur, still carries him into every week, but not the god they credited with running anything. Something else took the seat at the top of the pantheon. The hand that bought the world time was a payment Tyr made on a debt that was already owed. What he owed, the next act shows, was a seat he had never rightfully held. The Norse understood Thor as their own. But the pattern he embodies is not Norse in origin. It is 4,000 years old, and it traveled to Scandinavia before the first longships were built. The pattern is the thunder god who slays a serpent to release waters held captive. In the Vedic tradition, that god is Indra. His adversary is Vritra, a serpent coiled around a river so tightly that no water reaches the earth. Indra shatters the serpent's spine with a weapon called the Vajra, a mace forged for exactly this purpose. The Rigveda describes it in precise, almost liturgical terms. The serpent breaks open, rivers pour, the world is made habitable. The formula is specific, and it recurs across the tradition. A hero, a serpent, a weapon forged for the killing, water released as the consequence. Thor's story follows the same architecture. He goes fishing for the Midgard Serpent. He has a weapon, Mjolnir, that exists in Snorri's telling, explicitly to break the monster's grip on the world. In Voluspa, the two meet at Ragnarok and kill each other. Thor fells the serpent, staggers 9 steps, and dies of its venom. The Heimskvida poem preserves an earlier version of the same encounter. Thor's fishing expedition, a first attempt to strike at what coils beneath the sea. 2 traditions, 2 thunder gods, 2 serpents, 2 weapons forged for the exact same act. The resemblance is not coincidental. The comparative philologist Calvert Watkins demonstrated this in How to Kill a Dragon by tracing a shared Indo-European poetic formula back to the reconstructed ancestral language, a specific root, Gwen, meaning to strike or to kill, embedded in a metrical frame that appears in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Old Norse with the same internal structure. The formula is not just similar in content, it is the same sentence carried across 4 millennia and 4,000 miles by speakers of related languages who no longer shared a homeland, a pantheon, or a written tradition. The words changed, the gesture did not. Thor and Indra are not copies of each other. They are branches from the same trunk. The thunder god, a warrior who defends cosmic order by killing a serpent and releasing what the serpent holds, is a persistent figure across Indo-European mythology. The Greek tradition gives us Zeus fighting Typhon, a serpentine monster coiled around the cosmos. The Norse tradition gives us Thor and Jormungandr. The Vedic gives us Indra and Vritra. Same god, same monster, same weapon made to break the same hold. The comparative frame also names what is genuinely Norse in this pattern, not just inherited. Ragnarok's total ending, gods die, the world drowns in fire, nothing survives, has no parallel in the Greek or Vedic traditions. The Vedic imagines renewal, the Greek a surviving remnant. The Norse is the only branch that chose absolute termination. That choice is the god's own. It is not an inheritance. It is a decision made by a culture that had already rewritten everything it inherited. What came before the thunder god, what the thunder god displaced, is the subject of the next inheritance. The Norse gods did not arrive in Scandinavia as a complete system. They carried a structure with them that was already ancient. The transition of Tyr from a sovereign skyfather to a marginalized war god did not happen in a vacuum. It was a centuries-long ideological shift reflected in the very language of the Germanic tribes. When Tacitus attempted to make sense of the Germanic pantheon, he was not merely observing. He was actively translating their religious reality into Roman terms. This Interpretatio Romana provides a crucial snapshot of a religion in flux. The fact that the Germanic tribes appeased their Mars with animal sacrifices suggests a deity heavily involved in the brutal realities of tribal warfare, rather than the distant administration of cosmic justice. By equating Tywas with Mars rather than Jupiter, the Roman and Germanic observers implicitly acknowledged that the role of the supreme sovereign had already been usurped. This usurpation was almost certainly at the hands of Odin, whom Tacitus universally identified with Mercury. The shift from a stable, law-giving skyfather, Tiwaz, to an unpredictable, ecstatic god of poetry, magic, and death, Wodenaz, mirrors a profound transformation in Germanic society. As the migration period escalated, the need for a god who could guarantee victory through cunning and frenzy outstripped the need for a god who presided over static legal assemblies. The specific instruction in Sigurdrifumal to carve victory runes and invoke Tyr twice on the sword underscores this highly ritualized martial cult. Yet, even in this martial capacity, Tyr's power was strangely constrained. He was not the god you prayed to for the overall success of a campaign. He was the god you invoked for the sharp edge of the blade, the immediate, bloody reality of single combat. In the poetic tradition, this demotion is not merely implied, it is actively narrated. The systematic literary erasure of his supremacy reaches its zenith in Lokasenna, where Loki explicitly challenges Tyr's courage, undermining his status as a war god entirely. "You could never bring two men to peace," Loki sneers, a devastating critique for a god whose origins lay in the sovereign mediation of disputes. Snorri explicitly notes this in his later prose, emphasizing that Tyr is not a peacemaker among men. When Tyr attempts to defend the Aesir, he is dismissed as a secondary figure, a relic of an older order that no longer holds sway in the vibrant, treacherous hall of the gods. The humiliation continues in Hymiskvida, a text that fundamentally rewrites Tyr's genealogy. Instead of a sky father, Hymiskvida identifies Tyr's father as a Jotun, a surprising and degrading lineage for a former supreme deity. His interaction with his giant grandmother further embeds him in this monstrous lineage, stripping away the celestial associations of his Indo-European origins. He even needs Thor's help to retrieve a cauldron from his own father, portraying him as weak and reliant on the new generation of active, muscular gods. Snorri, attempting to synthesize these contradictory traditions, presents Tyr as a son of Odin in the prose Edda, which conflicts with Hymiskvida, but serves the exact same ideological purpose. Tyr is subordinated. He is no longer the father. He is the son, the dependent, the mocked and maimed remnant of a forgotten age. Long before Scandinavia had a name, a tradition imagined the world being made from a body that was already dead. The Rigveda, the oldest surviving religious text of any Indo-European tradition, composed in Sanskrit over 3,000 years ago, before Rome, before Athens, before the first longship left any harbor, opens hymn 1090 with a single image, a being called Purusha, described as having 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet, whose body encompasses the entire earth. The gods bind him. They press him down, and then they divide him, limb by limb, bone by bone. From his mouth come the priests who would perform every sacrifice the culture would ever need. From his arms, the warriors. From his thighs, the people. From his feet, the servants. His mind becomes the moon. His eye becomes the sun. His breath becomes the wind. The poem is explicit. The cosmos is not built from raw material or commanded into being by a word. It is carved out of a corpse. Nearly 3,000 years later, and 2,000 miles to the northwest, Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda tells a story with the same architecture. A primordial being called Ymir arises from the void, where the icy rivers meet the hot breath of Muspel. Ymir is not killed by a god in battle, not at first. He is slain in his sleep by Odin and his brothers, the first act of the Aesir, and from his body the world is assembled. His flesh becomes the earth, his blood the ocean, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky, his brain the clouds. The poet Vafthrud Nismal preserves an older version of the same image, where Ymir's eyebrows become a barrier around the place where the gods build their stronghold, a detail that predates Snorri's telling by centuries. In Grimnismal, the enumeration extends further. Ymir's flesh makes the land, his blood the sea, his skull the sky, his brows Midgard itself. Two traditions, two worlds disassembled from a single sacrificed body. The parallel is precise enough to have drawn scholarly attention for nearly a century, and the name of the tradition that takes it seriously is the comparative method. Bruce Lincoln, the scholar who has done more than anyone to map the linguistic architecture beneath these myths, points to the Proto-Indo-European root yemos, meaning twin. Ymir's name in this reading descends from it. The Rigveda has Yama, the first mortal, also the twin. The Vedic twin is paired with Yami. The Norse tradition keeps only one, but the name signals the shared inheritance. The Proto-Indo-Europeans, as far as the linguistic record allows scholars to reconstruct, told a story in which a primordial being, call him the first twin, the first man, the giant, was sacrificed to produce the world, and the three layers of that world, sky, earth, and the space between, each came from a different part of the body. Scholars call this the dismemberment of the first being motif, and it is one of the clearest recoverable stories the comparative method can claim. The poem records what the tradition said happened. The Norse version reaches us through 13th-century Christian Iceland. Where the two traditions disagree, the Norse version is usually the one that changed. The dismemberment motif in its original form, a body yielding a world in ordered parts, is almost never the Norse form. The pattern survives even when the specifics do not. And the pattern matters because it is one of the few stories the comparative method can reconstruct with real precision, a first being sacrificed by the gods, whose body becomes the ordered world. That is not the Norse creation story as Ipo one told it. It is something older, carried northward by speakers of a language that no one alive has ever heard, arriving in Scandinavia as a fragment that the Norse tradition reshaped into something that looks very different, and yet still recognizably the same gesture, from a different hand. The framework that tries to systematize everything we have just seen was built by a French scholar named Georges Dumézil, and it is one of the most influential and most contested structures in the study of Indo-European religion. Dumézil argued that the Proto-Indo-Europeans organized their gods, and by extension, their entire social world, around three functions. The first function is sovereignty, the power to command, to ordain, to sit at the center of the order. The second is the warrior function, the force that defends that order and expands it. The third is the producer function, the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the people, the things that make a community wealthy and stable. Every Indo-European pantheon, Dumézil argued, reflects this three-part structure, with at least one god for each function. In the Norse material, the reading looks like this. Odin is the sovereign, the god of wisdom, magic, war leadership, and the ultimate authority over what the Aesir decide. Thor is the warrior, the hammer-wielding defender of the divine order against the Jotnar, the figure who embodies force. Freyr, and through him the Vanir, is the producer, the god of peace and plenty, of harvest and prosperity, whose very presence makes the land fruitful. The Aesir, Vanir war, which the Norse sources treat as an internal myth, becomes in Dumézil's reading a mythic memory of a pantheon merger, a story the tradition preserved about two divine function groups coming together into a single order. The parallels are not confined to Scandinavia. The Rigveda places its sovereign in Varuna and its warrior in Indra, the same pairing Dumézil finds in Roman mythology with Jupiter and Mars. The divine twins, the Ashvins in the Vedic tradition, Castor and Pollux in the Greek, occupy a position that bridges the warrior and producer functions, and they appear in Tacitus's Germania as the twin sons of a sky father, recorded at the edges of the Roman world. The framework is elegant. It is also fiercely debated, and Dumézil's critics make the case that it does not fit the Norse material as cleanly as it first appears. The problem starts with what the gods actually do. Odin, the first function sovereign, is also a practitioner of Seda, a form of magic the Norse sources consistently associate with feminine practice, so much so that in Lokasena, Loki taunts him for behaving like a woman. Freyja, the Vanir goddess, is not a fertility deity tucked into the third function. She is a warrior who takes half the fallen in battle, the same selection Odin makes from his hall, and she appears in Grimnismal in a position that places her squarely in what Dumézil reserved for the second function. Thor's hammer, the purest second function symbol in the pantheon, is used in the myths not only to kill, but to bless marriages and hallow funeral pyres, actions that belong, in Dumézil's scheme, to the third. Freyja's brother Freyr, the producer god, is himself associated with warrior imagery in some sources. And then there is the Aesir, Vanir war itself. Dumézil reads it as a merger of two function groups, but the Norse sources tell a different story. The war begins with Gullveig being speared and burned, a Vanir figure tortured by the Aesir, and it ends with an exchange of hostages in which both sides give something up. The Vanir send Njordr and his children. The Aesir send Heinir and Mimir. The ritual of the exchange is real, documented in the sources, but what it represents, a merger, a truce, a forced accommodation, depends on which scholar you ask. Jens Peter Schott and John Lindo have both argued that Dumézil's framework imposes a coherence the Norse material does not always sustain. The gods keep crossing the lines he drew for them. That may mean the framework is wrong. It may also mean that the Norse tradition, by the time it reaches us, has already done something to the gods that Dumézil's model cannot account for. The framework works. It does not work. Both statements are true at once, and that tension, not the resolution of it, is what matters for this episode. 4. The comparative method is honest about what it can recover. It can recover names, Daios, Vatra, the Sky Father, from whose name Zeus and Jupiter and Tyr's own predecessor all descend. It can recover formulas, the Dragon Slayer, the dismemberment of the first being, the divine twin. It can recover gestures, the sacrifice, the binding, the slaying. A reconstructed Proto-Indo-European religion, a coherent system of gods with myths, personalities, and cult, is a projection, not a finding. This is the episode's hardest turn, and it demands the audience hold two things at once. The linguistic argument is real, and it has limits. Scholars disagree sharply about how far the comparative method can safely be pushed. J.P. Mallory puts the boundary clearly. Individual deity names like Daios can be reconstructed. A unified Proto-Indo-European pantheon cannot. What survives the millennia is a handful of inherited formulas and theological gestures, not a religion that anyone ever practiced. The step from these three traditions share a root to here is what the Proto-Indo-Europeans believed is a step that comparative method cannot legitimately make. And that matters enormously here, because the Norse material is the most distorted version of anything that survives. The Prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson, a Christian in the 13th century, centuries after the last Norse pagan temple was destroyed. Most of what survives of Norse myth reaches us through a handful of medieval Icelandic manuscripts copied by Christian scribes working in a language that had already absorbed centuries of Christian Latin vocabulary and literary convention. The Rigveda, by contrast, was preserved with almost phoneme-level precision across millennia of oral liturgical practice, every syllable fixed by ritual recitation that left no room for drift. Because of that precision, the Rigveda often gives us a clearer window into older Indo-European forms than anything in the Norse tradition. Where the Vedic and Norse versions disagree, the Norse version is almost always the innovation. The comparative method can tell us that. It cannot tell us what the original looked like. It can tell us that Tyr's name descends from the same root as Zeus and Jupiter. It cannot reconstruct a Proto-Indo-European skyfather who had a son like Thor or a snake like Jormungandr. That is invention, not reconstruction, and not scholarship. Creating a unified Proto-Indo-European religion by selecting the most dramatic elements from Greek and Vedic traditions and presenting them as recovered belief is curation dressed up as comparative method. The Proto-Indo-Europeans themselves were not a single people and not a bloodline. They were a reconstructed language community, a population that spoke related dialects of a single ancestral tongue, spread across thousands of miles of steppe and forest and river valley over centuries. Reconstructing their language does not guarantee reconstructing the exact beliefs of its speakers. The two are different kinds of inference. The Norse gods that reached Scandinavia carried a 4,000-year inheritance they never knew they had, and the tradition that recorded them was already a heavily transformed version of whatever arrived. What the comparative method honestly gives us is a pattern, a family of traditions that shared a linguistic ancestor, carried a handful of inherited formulas and theological gestures across thousands of years and thousands of miles, and then built wildly different gods out of them. The Norse gods are one branch of that family. Their sky father by descent is Tyr, not Odin, not Thor, But the Tyr who reached Scandinavia was already a Norse invention, a god remade by a culture that had forgotten the name of the sky and invented new ones to fill the gap. If the gods were not born in Scandinavia, they arrived there. The question is how? The most widely accepted answer places the Proto-Indo-European homeland on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland that arcs north of the Black Sea and east toward the Caspian. The evidence is not myth, it is archaeology, and it is genetics. David W. Anthony identifies the Yamnaya culture, which flourished roughly 3300 to 2600 BCE, as the most likely speakers of late Proto-Indo-European. What the Yamnaya had that made them expand was not just language, it was two technologies that changed everything: the wheeled wagon and the domesticated horse. The wagon gave them mobility across terrain that had previously been difficult to traverse. The horse gave them speed and reach that earlier pastoralists could not match. Together, those two inventions created a cultural package capable of spreading across extraordinary distances in a remarkably short time. The Rigveda is filled with imagery of horse-drawn chariots, the same technological package, carried thousands of miles east and embedded in the poetry of a culture that had been speaking an Indo-European language for millennia. The wagon did not disappear in the northern branch. In Norse myth, Thor's chariot is drawn by goats, a local substitution, but the vehicle itself remains the same structure, the same inherited idea of a divine conveyance pulled by living animals across the sky or the earth. Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE, described the Germanic goddess Nerthus being drawn in a sacred wagon through the countryside in a ritual procession, classical attestation of the same religious gesture that reaches back to the steppe. The physical evidence in Scandinavia confirms it. The Trundholm sun chariot, pulled from a peat bog in Denmark and dated to the Nordic Bronze Age, is a ceramic disc depicting the sun being drawn across the sky by a horse, a direct archaeological confirmation of the religious use of horse-drawn vehicles in the north. Nordic Bronze Age rock art is dense with ships, horses, and wheeled vehicles, the visual culture of a people who had absorbed the steppe's religious iconography and made it their own. Ancient DNA adds a second independent line of evidence. Two landmark studies showed that the Yamnaya-mediated population replacement across Neolithic Europe was massive, with corded ware populations in Central Europe carrying roughly 75% Yamnaya ancestry. What the genetics confirms is that a large-scale population movement from the steppe did reach Scandinavia, carrying its technologies, its languages, and almost certainly fragments of the religious tradition that traveled with them. But fragments is the right word. The gods were never Scandinavian. The question is only how much of what they carried is still visible after that long a journey. The comparative method, for all its power to illuminate the deep past, is not a time machine. It is an exercise in rigorous inference, and its limits must be clearly understood. Creating a unified Proto-Indo-European religion by picking and choosing from different branches is historically invalid synthesis. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were a reconstructed language community, not a monolith, and certainly not a single bloodline. Genetic ancestry does not equal language or culture. Languages can be adopted, adapted, and fundamentally altered by new populations over thousands of years. Scholars rightly warn that reconstructing a language does not guarantee reconstructing the exact beliefs of its speakers. A starred, reconstructed word like Dias is a hypothesis, a ghost in the linguistic machine, not an archaeological artifact you can hold in your hand. This brings us to the most contentious aspect of Indo-European religious reconstruction, Dumezil's trifunctional hypothesis. Dumezil proposed that Indo-European mythology is structured around three social functions: sovereignty, or magic, force, or war, and fertility production. While elegant, this hypothesis has faced significant criticism from modern historians and philologists. Critics argue that trifunctionalism forces diverse and often contradictory myths into a rigid structure, ignoring data that does not fit the mold. For instance, critics point out that Dumézil often ignored female deities or forced them into male-dominated functional roles. Freya, despite being a Vanir goddess ostensibly tied to fertility, the third function, is heavily associated with war and death, choosing half the slain for her Hall Folkvanger, a purely martial function. Odin's magic, Zaida, meanwhile, is often associated with feminine practices, complicating his neat placement in the first function sovereignty. Furthermore, the Norse gods themselves frequently cross these functional boundaries. Thor, the quintessential second function warrior, was widely invoked for fertility and crop protection, bleeding into the third function. Adam of Bremen's historical account describes Thor as ruling the weather and crops at Uppsala, completely outside his role as a giant slayer. His hammer, Mjolnir, is used not just to kill, but to bless marriages and funeral pyres, proving its multifunctional nature. Conversely, the Vanir, representing the third function, are not merely peaceful agriculturalists. The Aesir-Vanir war begins with the Aesir spearing and burning Gulvai, a Vanir figure, initiating a violent conflict that defies simple categorizations. Hainr and Mimir are sent to the Vanir as hostages, showing a complex two-way exchange of power and knowledge that transcends a simple war of functions. Ultimately, some scholars suggest the Vanir might not even be Indo-European, but instead represent indigenous Scandinavian gods incorporated by incoming populations. The mythological war between the Aesir and the Vanir, described in Voluspa, might reflect this cultural synthesis rather than a purely structural Indo-European motif. Njordr was given as a hostage by the Vanir, but is destined to return to them at the end of the world, highlighting his distinct and enduring status apart from the Aesir. Runes of victory, ale, and birth are all taught together in the poetic tradition, mixing magic, war, and fertility indiscriminately. The Norse pantheon is messy, contradictory, and deeply rooted in its local landscape. Recent popular critiques of PIE reconstruction argue that historians often invent Proto-Indo-European religion by arbitrarily combining Greek and Vedic myths, ignoring the unique, localized development of traditions like the Norse. The linguistics points east toward the grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the broad plain that arcs around the western end of the Black Sea, and north along the Volga. This is the most widely accepted homeland for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a reconstructed language community rather than a single people, whose descendants would eventually spread from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the river valleys of northern India. Scholars agree the migrations from this region during the 3rd millennium BCE were massive. David Anthony identifies the Yamnaya culture, active roughly 3300 to 2600 BCE, as the likely speakers of late Proto-Indo-European. What made the Yamnaya different from every culture around them was the wheeled wagon. The invention and spread of the wheeled wagon was crucial to the Yamnaya expansion, not because it was a weapon, but because it was a logistical revolution. A wagon lets a community carry its household, its seed, its dead, everything that defines a society, across distances that would otherwise be insurmountable. The Indo-European expansion was not a wave of swords. It was a wave of wheels. Anthony argues that horse domestication, accomplished around 3500 BCE on the steppe itself, allowed the Yamnaya to exploit the open grasslands and expand at a pace no settled agricultural society could match. The horse and the wagon together created a mobility that changed the scale of what a single community could reach. The Rig Veda, the oldest text in any Indo-European language, composed in the Indian subcontinent, is filled with imagery of horse-drawn chariots, reflecting the steppe technological heritage that its authors carried with them across 3,000 miles of landscape. The Norse tradition preserved the same inheritance in its own register. In Snorri's telling, Thor travels in a chariot drawn not by horses, but by goats. But the vehicle itself, the idea of the god moving across the world in a pulled conveyance, persists. The animal changed. The wagon did not. Tacitus gives us one of the clearest classical attestations. In his account of the Germanic peoples, he describes the goddess Nerthus being drawn through the countryside in a sacred wagon, a ritual procession in which the vehicle itself was treated as a living religious object. This is not a borrowed Greek story. Tacitus is describing Germanic practice, and the wagon at its center carries the same structural logic as the Rigveda's chariots and the Edda's divine vehicles, a god moved by wheel. The vehicle as a bridge between the divine and the human world. In Scandinavia itself, the archaeological record provides physical confirmation. The Trundholm Sun chariot, a bronze disc depicting the sun being drawn across the sky, recovered from a peat bog in Denmark and dated to the Nordic Bronze Age, archaeologically confirms the religious use of horse-drawn vehicles in the far north. It is not a wagon in the Yamnaya sense, but the visual grammar is identical. The sun pulled by an animal, the cosmos understood as a vehicle in motion. Nordic Bronze Age rock art adds more evidence. Depictions of ships, horses, and wheeled vehicles carved into stone across the North Sea basin. The mechanism is clear. A people who spoke a form of Proto-Indo-European crossed the steppe in wagons, spread across Europe, reached the fringes of Scandinavia, and left behind a religious iconography that persisted for millennia. The gods arrived by wagon. The wagon crosses the steppe. The name of the god driving it does not survive the journey intact. The archaeological and linguistic evidence now converges on something real. A reconstructed language community that spread across Eurasia, leaving linguistic and material traces that scholars can track. But genetics adds a new and sharper instrument, one that tracks not words or parts, but people themselves. Recent advances in ancient DNA have revolutionized the study of Indo-European origins, and the genetic data from 2 independent studies published in the same issue of Nature in 2015 told a remarkably consistent story. Wolfgang Hack and colleagues demonstrated that the corded ware culture in Central Europe shows a massive genetic shift linking it to the Yamnaya, and that corded ware populations derived approximately 75% of their ancestry from steppe sources. Hack's team explicitly linked this massive migration to the spread of Indo-European languages in Europe, connecting the genetic data back to the linguistic tree. Morten Allentoft and his team, working independently from a broader Eurasian sample, confirmed the same pattern at scale. Large-scale population replacements across Bronze Age Eurasia, consistent with a Yamnaya-mediated expansion. Where the Yamnaya went, the local gene pool was substantially replaced. The steppe did not just export a language, it exported people. In Scandinavia specifically, the corded ware expansion manifested as the single grave culture, named for its characteristic burial form, a single body laid in a stone setting beneath a mound, a practice imported from the steppe and distinct from the collective farming burial traditions of earlier Neolithic Scandinavia. The material culture that accompanied these burials reinforces the picture. Stone battle axes, the signature artifact of the corded ware tradition, reflect a martial ideology imported alongside the language itself. Yamnaya and corded ware burials also share a structural feature that distinguishes them sharply from what came before. The individual, named male warrior, laid beneath a burial mound, surrounded by weapons. This is not a farming community's relationship to death. It is a warrior elite's, and the genetic evidence strongly suggests the society behind it was patrilineal, patriarchal, and organized around kinship lines that traced descent through the male line. Reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary is rich in terms for patrilineal kinship and martial concepts, aligning the linguistic evidence with the burial archaeology. None of this says anything about gods yet. Genetics tracks people. It does not track theology. A population can carry a language without carrying its religion intact, and the gods that traveled with those steppe migrations into Scandinavia arrived in a form that was already beginning to change. Because here is the central problem the evidence exposes. The Norse material reaches us through 13th-century Christian Iceland. Every Norse myth we have was written down by a Christian scribe in a monastery after the old religion had been dead for centuries. The Vedic material, by contrast, was preserved with exact phonetic precision through millennia of oral liturgical practice. The Vedic tradition did not merely remember its hymns. It disciplined itself through an elaborate mnemonic system to transmit them word for word across 3,000 years. The Norse tradition was remembered differently, by poets working from fragments in a language that had already changed beyond recognition, for an audience that no longer believed in the gods they were describing. Where the two traditions disagree, the Norse version is usually the innovation. The Rig Veda preserves archaic poetic formulas, entire syntactic structures that the Eddas have already lost. The Norse material reached Iceland through centuries of oral transmission in a culture that was, by the time Snorri wrote the prose Edda, already Christian. What survives is not the oldest version. It is the most recent. The oldest form of any Indo-European myth is almost never the Norse one. The comparative method's honest product is not a recovered pantheon, but a pattern of relationships, and the pattern shows that the Norse branch, the one that reached Scandinavia last, across the longest distance through the most intermediaries, is the one that changed the most along the way. The mythology that comes down to us from the north is not a pristine window into the ancient past, but rather a late, highly innovative branch, heavily modified by centuries of local development. To look at the Norse gods is to look at a religion that has traveled far from its origins, across landscapes and through time, gathering new shapes along the way. The texts that preserve these myths do not date from the period when the gods were actively worshipped as living realities. The prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson, a Christian in the 13th century, long after paganism had ended. He was writing not a manual of faith, but a manual of poetry, looking back across a chasm of cultural change. Most of our detailed Norse myths survive only in manuscripts from medieval Iceland. This manuscript bottleneck means that what we have is an inheritance filtered through scribes who fundamentally rejected the theology they were recording. This context of transmission stands in stark contrast to other branches of the Indo-European family. The Vedic texts were preserved with exact phonetic precision through millennia of oral liturgical practice. The practitioners of the Vedic tradition understood that the precise oral transmission was essential for efficacious ritual, preserving archaic Proto-Indo-European poetic forms in the process. Their method was one of rigorous memorization, ensuring that syllables remained intact even as the centuries passed. Because of its early date and rigid transmission, the Rig Veda often provides a clearer window into older forms than the Eddas. Where the Norse and Vedic traditions diverge, it is almost invariably the Norse branch that represents the newer development. The differences are not merely the result of time, but of contact. As the language and its associated cultural concepts moved northward, they did not enter an empty land. Norse mythology likely incorporates significant elements from the pre-Indo-European substrate populations of Scandinavia. The resulting synthesis was unique to the harsh environments and specific histories of the north. The gods who emerged from this process were profoundly altered from their steppe origins. Ultimately, the Norse gods must be understood in their medieval Scandinavian context, not just as Indo-European fossils. They are the product of their final environment, shaped by the cold, the sea, and the eventual triumph of a new religion that sought to categorize and contain them as historical curiosities rather than divine sovereigns. The comparative method provides the baseline, but the specific contours of the Norse pantheon are a distinctly local phenomenon. The Norse tradition is characterized by a fatalistic tone, a sense of impending doom that permeates even its most triumphant narratives. This bleakness is a defining feature of the youngest branch. The gods are mortal in a way that their southern cousins are not. They are bound by fate, destined to fight and die. This is the theology of a culture that has reimagined the divine through the lens of its own harsh realities and the inevitable decay of its ancient systems. The careful curation of these myths by Christian scholars added a final layer of interpretation, framing the old gods within a new cosmological order. To understand the deepest origins of the gods, we must look not to the frozen fjords, but to the vast expanses of the east. The Pontic-Caspian steppe is the most widely accepted homeland for the Proto-Indo-Europeans. This immense stretch of grassland, spanning from the Black Sea to the Caspian, provided the crucible for a linguistic and cultural expansion that would reshape the continent. From this harsh but open environment, a profound demographic shift began. Massive migrations from the steppe into Europe occurred during the 3rd millennium BCE. These were not simple raids, but the movement of entire communities, carrying with them a language, a social structure, and the foundational elements of a cosmology that would eventually reach the shores of Scandinavia. The archaeological record provides crucial insights into the mechanisms of this expansion. David Anthony identifies the Yamnaya culture, active roughly 3300 to 2600 BCE, as the likely speakers of late Proto-Indo-European. The defining technological advantage of the Yamnaya was not initially military, but logistical. The invention and spread of the wheeled wagon was crucial to the Yamnaya expansion. This innovation allowed communities to transport their entire livelihood across the trackless steppe, transforming the grasslands from a barrier into a highway. Anthony argues that horse domestication allowed the Yamnaya to exploit the open steppe and expand rapidly. The combination of the horse and the wheeled vehicle created an unprecedented level of mobility. This technological revolution left a permanent mark on the religious imagination of the descendants of the steppe. The Rigveda is filled with imagery of horse-drawn chariots, reflecting the steppe technological heritage. The gods of the Vedas move across the sky in shining vehicles, a direct translation of the material reality of the steppe into the divine realm. The Rigveda heavily associates the Ashvins with horses, Ashva, linking them to the steppe technological package. In the north, the same structural motif survives, albeit adapted to the local environment. In Norse myth, Thor's chariot is drawn by goats, but the wagon itself remains a central divine vehicle. The animals change, but the vehicle persists as a symbol of divine power and mobility. This association of the divine with wheeled transport is deeply rooted in Germanic tradition. Tacitus describes the Germanic goddess Nerthus being drawn in a sacred wagon. This ritual procession echoes the ancient connection between the gods and the vehicles that conquered the steppe. The physical evidence from Scandinavia further corroborates this enduring theme. The Trundholm sun chariot from the Nordic Bronze Age archaeologically confirms the religious use of horse-drawn vehicles. This artifact, depicting a gilded disc pulled by a horse, demonstrates how thoroughly the concept had integrated into northern cosmology. Furthermore, Nordic Bronze Age rock art features numerous depictions of ships, horses, and wheeled vehicles. It is important to acknowledge that the reconstruction of history is complex and subject to ongoing debate. While the steppe hypothesis is dominant, the Anatolian hypothesis, which focuses on the spread of farming, remains a scholarly alternative. The Anatolian hypothesis posits that Proto-Indo-European spread with early farmers from Anatolia around 7000 BCE, though recent genetics heavily favor the steppe model. The preponderance of evidence now points to the rolling grasslands and the transformative power of the wheel as the true origin point for the linguistic ancestors of the North. The profound transformation of the pantheon highlights the malleability of myth over millennia. Generations of oral transmission slowly eroded the original supremacy of the ancient Skyfather. This relentless shift in divine hierarchy reflects deeper societal changes among the early Germanic tribes. As the environment grew colder and more unforgiving, the gods themselves were reimagined as darker, more fatalistic beings. The intricate web of linguistic inheritance demonstrates how deeply human language is entwined with spiritual belief. Every surviving manuscript is a fragile bridge across centuries of forgotten oral tradition. The slow, grinding wheels of historical linguistics reveal the forgotten architectures of ancient thought. Beneath the surface of the medieval texts lies a vast reconstructed landscape of prehistoric ideology. The brutal pragmatism of the northern climate demanded gods who understood the inevitability of loss and destruction. We are left with fragments, echoes of a grand cosmology that was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. The comparative method allows us to peer through the static of centuries, discerning the faint outlines of a forgotten supreme deity. Each linguistic root is a monument to a vanished world, standing silently amid the ruins of later mythologies. The slow accumulation of variations over time created an entirely new theological ecosystem in Scandinavia. The distance between the reconstructed past and the recorded present is immense, filled with the silence of unrecorded generations. When the world ends in the Norse imagination, the Skyfather is reduced to a footnote. The great eschatological poem, Völuspá, details the destruction of the cosmos with terrifying precision, yet it is marked by a profound absence. Tyr is conspicuously absent from the major cosmic events described in Völuspá. The god whose name carries the ancient inheritance of supreme sovereignty plays no part in the central drama of the final battle. At Ragnarok, Tyr fights the hound Garma, and they kill each other. This is a secondary skirmish, far removed from the titanic clashes between Thor and the Serpent, or Odin and the Wolf. The former king of the gods is relegated to dying alongside a monstrous dog, a striking demotion that underscores the complete erasure of his original status. This vision of cosmic termination is itself highly unusual within the broader Indo-European context. The eschatological destruction of the gods at Ragnarok has no clear parallel in Proto-Indo-European reconstruction and is likely a Norse innovation. While other traditions imagine cycles of ages or periodic renewals, the Norse mythology envisions a definitive, catastrophic end to the divine order. Völuspá's detailed description of Ragnarok is structurally unique among Indo-European traditions. The bleak eschatology of Ragnarok is often interpreted as a reflection of harsh northern environments or late societal collapse. The grim reality of life in Scandinavia, coupled perhaps with the anxieties of a changing world, forged a mythology where even the gods are subject to an inescapable doom. This stands in stark contrast to the religious frameworks that developed elsewhere from the same ancient roots. The Rigveda focuses on maintaining cosmic order, known as Ata, through sacrifice, lacking the doomed fatalism of Norse myth. The Vedic tradition is primarily concerned with sustaining the universe, not describing its inevitable destruction. Similarly, the classical world imagined a different trajectory. Hesiod describes declining ages of man, from gold to iron, but not a final cosmic battle where all gods die. The Greek gods are immortal and unassailable in a way the Norse gods are not. The narrative structure of the Norse cosmos is fundamentally different. The narrative arc of Voluspa moves linearly from creation to absolute destruction. It is a story with a definitive beginning and a terrifying end. However, the finality of this destruction is complicated by the circumstances of the text's preservation. Snorri's account of a surviving new world after Ragnarok may be influenced by Christian apocalyptic thought. The vision of a cleansed earth rising from the sea, where a new generation of peaceful gods reigns, bears a striking resemblance to the Book of Revelation. The true pagan ending might have been absolute, but the surviving record offers a glimmer of rebirth, perhaps reflecting the hopes of the Christian scribes who preserved the tales of the missing ruler and his doomed kin. The name of the displaced king survives in the most mundane of places. The Old English word tiu survives in Tuesday, or Tivus Daig, translating the Latin Dies Martis. This linguistic fossil is a testament to a god who once held the highest position before being overshadowed by Odin. To understand how his worshippers reached the shores of the North Sea, we must turn to the hard science of human remains. Recent advances in ancient DNA have revolutionized the study of Indo-European origins. The genetic data provides a stark, empirical counterpart to the subtleties of comparative linguistics. The corded ware culture in Europe shows a massive genetic shift linking it to the Yamnaya. This was not a peaceful diffusion of ideas. Hack and colleagues in 2015 demonstrated that corded ware populations derived approximately 75% of their ancestry from the Yamnaya. Hack explicitly links this massive migration to the spread of Indo-European languages in Europe. The language traveled with the people. Independent studies confirmed this dramatic demographic event. Allentoft and his team in 2015 independently confirmed the large-scale population replacements across Bronze Age Eurasia. Genetics show Yamnaya ancestry replaced most of the male lineages in Neolithic Europe. The impact of this migration was profound and transforming. The single grave culture in Scandinavia represents the local manifestation of the corded ware expansion. The material culture they brought with them reflected a society fundamentally different from the earlier farming communities. The corded ware culture is characterized by stone battle axes, reflecting a martial ideology. This martial focus is evident in how they treated their dead. Scandinavian single grave burials contain battle axes placed carefully with the deceased. Yamnaya and corded ware burials prioritize individual male warriors under burial mounds, known as kurgans. The genetic and burial evidence strongly suggests a patrilineal, patriarchal social structure. Reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary is rich in terms for patrilineal kinship and martial concepts. The arrival of these people and their language laid the groundwork for the later mythologies. The Nordic Bronze Age, spanning roughly 1700 to 500 BCE, saw a massive influx of bronze metalwork and new religious iconography. The centrality of the wagon in Bronze Age religion reflects a massive ideological shift tied to the new technology. They brought the wheel, they brought the horse, and they brought the name of the Sky Father, though he would not keep his throne. The grand narrative of linguistic expansion and genetic replacement ends not in triumph, but in the dark halls of Asgard. To fully understand the sprawling distance between the ancient linguistic roots and the eventual medieval texts, we must consider the sheer expanse of time separating them. The PIE language community is generally dated to the 4th millennium BCE, thousands of years before the Viking Age. This vast chronological gulf means that the earliest shared religious concepts were forced to survive millennia of unrecorded transmission before ever being written down. Yet, certain core architectural features of their cosmology proved incredibly resilient, leaving indelible marks across vastly different geographies. The etymological connection of Ymir to Yemo, twin, proves the myth's Indo-European antiquity despite its late Norse attestation. This linguistic fossil preserves a fundamental truth about the shared religious heritage of the prehistoric world, echoing across generations of speakers. Building upon these linguistic foundations, Bruce Lincoln reconstructs a Paiyi creation myth based on a twin, Yemo Zhao Ymir, and a man, Manu. The narrative structures surrounding these figures form a common bedrock for traditions that would later diverge entirely. This primordial story of sacrifice and the physical construction of the cosmos is echoed in the earliest written records of Northern Europe. Tacitus mentions an earthborn god, Tuisto, twin, and his son Manus, man, as founders of the Germanic people. The act of creation through destruction remains central to this inherited framework. Moving forward to the Icelandic sources, Snorri details how Odin, Vili, and Ve carried Ymir to Ginnungagap to make the world from his body. This is not a uniquely Norse invention, but the late expression of a much older paradigm. The poetic tradition confirms this brutal architectural endeavor. Grimnismal 40 matches the motif, stating the sky was made from Ymir's skull and the sea from his blood. Furthermore, Snorri adds that the dwarves Nordri, Sudri, Austri, and Vestri were placed to hold up Ymir's skull. Though separated by immense distances, the southern branches of the linguistic family maintained a similar memory of cosmic violence. In a parallel but geographically distant narrative, the Rigveda vividly describes the shattering of Vritra's body and the flowing of rivers. As scholars attempted to map these deep commonalities, they developed structural models to explain the inherited pantheon. In one of the most influential frameworks, Dumézil mapped Odin and Tyr to the first function as magical and juridical sovereigns, respectively. This rigid tripartite system categorized the divine hierarchy according to social utility. Within this model, the Vanir, Njordr, Freya mapped to the third function, representing wealth, agriculture, and fertility. However, this theoretical neatness often fails to capture the turbulent reality of the surviving myths. Historical accounts reveal a religious practice far messier than the models suggest. Adam of Bremen records that Fricko, Freya, was worshipped for peace and pleasure, with a phallic idol. Yet these deities frequently step outside their designated domains. Grimnismal 14 states Freya chooses half the slain for her hall Folkvanga, a purely martial function. The rigid categories of the trifunctional hypothesis struggle to contain gods who repeatedly violate their own supposed archetypes. Thor is consistently portrayed as the sole reliable defender of Asgard against the Jotnar. The interactions between different groups of gods within the Norse cosmos hint at deep historical syntheses. The great mythological conflict ultimately led to an uneasy integration of divine families. Snorri describes the truce and hostage exchange that united the Aesir and Vanir. This mythological event might preserve the memory of real-world cultural collisions. This merging of traditions was not seamless, and cultural friction is evident in the surviving narratives. Loki accuses Njordr of having a child with his own sister, reflecting a Vanir practice anathema to the Aesir. As we navigate this complex web of reconstructed history, we must acknowledge the limitations of our methodologies. We are dealing with inferences based on fragmentary evidence. The Rigveda describes Diospita as a father, but grants him very few independent hymns compared to Agni or Indra. We can map the shadows, but the living, breathing reality of that ancient belief system remains forever beyond our reach. When Fenrir the wolf bites off the hand of the god who was once supreme, the other deities do not mourn the loss of his power or the tragedy of his sacrifice. They just laugh. The echoes of this ancient past continue to resonate, inviting us to reflect on the nature of belief and the relentless passage of time. These stories, though fragmented and transformed, offer a profound meditation on human resilience and the enduring power of narrative. we are reminded that even the most formidable structures of thought are subject to the erosive forces of history. In the end, the tales we tell serve as a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and highest aspirations across the vast expanse of centuries. By engaging with these narratives, we participate in a continuous dialogue with the distant past, bridging the immense gap between the reconstructed past and our present reality. The journey through these mythological landscapes is ultimately a journey into the human condition itself, revealing the universal desire to find meaning amid the chaos of existence.